Can we talk about the ongoing storm of controversy around critical race theory? For the last 10 months, I've been off. I haven't been making any videos because I've been transferring doctoral programs. I had been in a PhD where I was employing critical race theory to examine racial diversity in denominational leadership. And now I'm in a different doctoral program where I'm looking at anti-racist literature. My stance is going to be coming from critical whiteness studies. That's the lens through which I'm going to try and look at this thing. So those are a lot of words. And if you don't know the difference between critical race theory, anti-racist literature, and critical whiteness studies, you may think that it's this academic thing of drawing lines and policing boundaries, and that's how academic stuff works. And so some people get flustered and they sort of throw their hands up. But actually, those distinctions are really important and illustrate the point that I want to make today. So it's like when somebody isn't into marijuana, and then somebody who's like an aficionado or a connoisseur says, well, you have THC, you have CBD, and you have hemp. But to an outsider, they just say, well, it's all pot, right? And or to use a religious example, if you don't know the difference between Pentecostals, charismatics, and evangelicals, you might group them all together and say, well, they're happy clappy and they all sing these, songs, the rock and roll sort of stadium songs that they're getting off the Christian radio. But for those inside, the difference between charismatics and Pentecostals is quite profound. And then evangelicals, even more so. So when you are outside of something, often it is easy to paint with a broad brush and to sort of make general categorizations and groupings. But then if you're an insider, you're actually doing the activity, the distinctions become really profound and telling. And that's what we have going on here, because in my time off, and by the way, thank you to everyone who takes time to send me resources to help with my research. Between emails and actual in-print publications, and we can talk about this next week, by the way. It has been so wonderful. This is one of the reasons I love doing public theology, sort of doing theology in public, is because the crowdsourcing that helps for people resources to point me in directions for research, it is incredibly helpful. And I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate it very much. So that's part of why I do these videos, is the investment to actually sort of learn out loud and in public, because the give and take is an education in itself. And so I just want to say thank you for that. So one of the things I have noticed, however, in my time off is that this conversation, to say that the waters are muddy is an understatement. Actually, what's going on is really troubling. Because for those who are opponents of CRT, there is an intentional confusing of categories in order to make a point or to raise the animosity and the alarm. And it's somewhat disingenuous, because now you won't see that in the actual debate itself, in the actual exchange about the subject, but in another place you will see them show their cards, and it's what's going on over there in the place where they're most concerned about that you figure out, like, oh, okay, so we're not having the same conversation. So here's my take on sort of this whole controversy and what's been happening. What has emerged, what has been exposed, is that there's a confusion of categories, and what they're really more probably upset about is anti-racist literature. And that gets grouped in with things like even diversity training, and it all gets lumped together as CRT. So that's part of what muddies the water, is that the critics aren't careful, and because they're trying to sound the alarm bells, they're intentionally confusing. Now, that would be concerning enough in itself, but we could handle that. what has happened in the last couple years that has come to light is that actually what's going on is that they don't want to talk about race at all. So it's not just critical race theory that they're concerned about or upset at. It's any mention of race at all. Because even in things like the history books, there is a movement, in the same way, to take out any mention of whether it's slavery or settler colonialism and how the land with the natives. And so it turns out that so you just don't want to talk about this at all. You don't want this to be an issue at any level. You don't want it in English class. You don't want it in math. You don't want it in history class. So your problem isn't with critical race theory. That just happens to be the shiny light, the target that attracts the attention. Actually, what's going on, so I call that the fruit and the root. So the fruit is this controversy around CRT. The root is a desire to not address the racial history of this country at all. So if that's where this thing is rooted, then all of this drawing of lines and the sounding of alarms and picking out extreme examples to try and attract as much attention as possible is sort of a disingenuous thing. And so, I don't mind talking with people about critical race theory if that's really what they're concerned about, or anti-racist literature, right? I'll talk about that. I'm very interested in that and the ongoing developments and popularity of that. Diversity training, we can talk about that too. But if what's really going on is that you don't want to look at or address or be made aware of at all of anything dealing with race at any level, then that's a different conversation. So, there's not a lot to be done in that situation. I mean, you can try and debate with fruit and sort things out and try and change whatever there. But when you figure out where this thing is rooted, it really changes the conversation quite a bit. So let me know if that is helpful distinction at all. I know that if you're an academic, you probably think that I'm policing boundaries and terms. That's sort of an academic concern. If you're an opponent of CRT, you may not like trying to bring in some nuance and to be careful with the terms. But for most people who are caught up in this controversy, or maybe it's on the periphery and they get brought into it in different conversations, I hope that helps a little bit to say that what's happening on both ends, right, the extremes, can be confusing, but part of the reason that that's the case is that it's intentional by the opponents of CRT. Let me know if that is helpful at all. I will look forward to hearing from you. This will be an ongoing conversation, and maybe next week we will talk about some of the logical fallacies embedded in by the critics of CRT. If you like the content, feel free to subscribe. I've also set up a Patreon and a PayPal if you're interested.